In the previous two episodes, I presented my thoughts on wars always being a matter of choice and the rationality underlying apparently irrational decisions. But is choosing war ever a rational decision? And that's the subject of this episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired, and this series of podcasts is intended to be a kind of war college for everyone, working out the things I think every citizen should know about war to better exercise their responsibilities as citizens and hold their elected officials accountable for their decisions about war and peace. As I said in the previous episode, Clausewitz wrote that governments should make rational decisions about embarking upon and ending wars using what we would call today a cost-benefit analysis. He wrote, "Once the expenditure of effort exceeds the value of the political object, the object must be renounced and peace must follow." And it doesn't have to get all the way to that point. It would be preferable, of course, to determine a priori that the state either does not have the resources to achieve the political object or that the cost will inevitably exceed its value and the war end at that point, or never begin. There is an analogy to this in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus asks, "What king going to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and take counsel whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is still a great way off, he sends embassy and asks for terms of peace." All of this presumes that the decision to go to war can be rational. But is it? I'm inclined to say no. I believe that in a very real way, a primary purpose of the just war theory was to provide a framework for a rational decision about going to or fighting a war. There must be a just cause under a just authority, which is presumed to be accountable for the exercise of that authority. There must be a right intent, which should demand introspection and at least mitigate the pressures of passion. Most important for a rational decision about war would be proportionality and a high likelihood of success. Of course, we must also ask whether this is a last resort. Are there other ways and means, more cost-effective ways and means available to achieve the political objective? Now, one could make a rational decision about going to war without fulfilling each of these criteria. One could, in a purely Machiavellian fashion, make a rational decision to go to war where there is no just cause. And of course, without a just cause, there will be no right intent. Last resort could also be irrelevant to that decision-making. Rationality in going to war would depend only on proportionality and likelihood of success. Even there, proportionality would mean something very different than it does in just war theory. In this manner of reasoning, instead of avoiding unnecessary or excessive damage, and particularly to non-combatants, proportionality refers only to the cost of waging the war measured against the benefits expected to come from the war. Rationality also depends on likelihood of success, as it would be foolish to begin or continue a war where there is little hope of success. But is the just war theory even relevant to the rationality of war? Pope Leo XIV's recent encyclical Magnifica Humanitatis includes a statement that the just war theory is outdated. Now, like many statements from many popes, the context is important. Outdated doesn't mean obsolete. Much of the language that precedes and follows his statement refers to jus ad bellum and jus in bello principles. And I may do a more thorough analysis of this encyclical as it affects the ancient art of modern warfare in a future episode. For now, I believe that Leo proposes that just war theory needs updating to reflect abuse of that theory in modern armed conflict, and that is relevant to the current topic. His concerns include the use of artificial intelligence to create spurious just causes for war, and that algorithms can be used to justify armed conflict as a last resort before any meaningful effort has been made for nonviolent resolution of real or manufactured causes. AI can also be used to create the perception of proportionality while removing human beings from making the decision to use lethal force or to evaluate the human toll of warfare. All in all, the just war theory, historically intended to restrict or limit war, has in recent years been turned completely on its head to justify choosing war when other options exist, rather than only fighting when it is truly necessary. And AI has the potential to make this situation even worse. But even without considering the just war theory with its moral and ethical precepts, can we rationally choose to go to war? I believe that the decision to go to war is never completely rational. And by the way, neither did Clausewitz. The economic costs alone cannot be justified by any possible material benefit of going to war. These costs aren't just the direct costs in terms of tanks, aircraft, munitions of various sorts, and other war material. The human costs are rarely, if ever, calculated correctly. And this is a key point that Pope Leo makes. Even looking at human costs in a transactional rather than an ethical decision reveal that we do not make rational decisions. For example, I've read in many reports, posts, and opinion pieces over my military career which state that it takes a few months to make a soldier. Untrue. Even a basic infantryman really takes 20 years to produce, 16 years for states that recruit at the lowest permissible age under international humanitarian law. These 16 to 20 years include the future soldier's education, housing, feeding, health care, and all other expenses necessary to even get someone eligible to enlist before the cost of his military training. Leaders and technical specialists, of course, are even more expensive in time and dollars. Additionally, each one of those soldiers, sailors, airmen, marine, etc., represents human capital removed from the economy. This is particularly relevant to Western, information-based economies where, in the case of the United States, our new recruits represent the top 15% of their age group. Each person lost in combat, or even lost in training, is lost to that economy forever, as well as his or her potential contributions to art, literature, and future generations. In modern societies, that person lost in military service represents continued costs to support the family left behind. Then there are immediate and sustained costs of the damage and repair to infrastructure, homes, other buildings, etc. Now, these not only need to be repaired or replaced, each one of those represents lost economic contributions or second and third order human impacts and must also be paid for. Then there is the moral cost. Napoleon, Clausewitz, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas all agree that this is the most important consideration in war. And what value can we place on that? Whatever the value, those costs can continue to accrue long after the fighting stops. What is the cost to the spirit of a nation when dealing with the physical and moral cost of the war? PTSD is not limited to individuals. The entire generation after World War I is called the Lost Generation, as the Great War, the war to end all wars, shattered that generation's confidence in traditional values, the very idea of heroic virtue, morality, and even religious institutions. And that applied to the victors and the defeated nations alike. That dispirit helped open the door for the next war. What value do we place on that? Can it even be calculated in advance? Of course, there is also the possibility, which is far less remote than most political leaders seem willing to admit, that you might lose the war you are choosing to fight. And what can possibly be gained from a war that balances out that cost-benefit analysis? Yet, wars are fought. Nations make decisions to go to war as a matter of policy, and that policy directs the nature and general strategy of the war. That policy often responds to emotion rather than reason. The decision to go to war, therefore, is rarely, if ever, a rational act. But what can we, as citizens of a republic, do about that? Now, when I was chief of staff, I used to tell the members of my staff that if the boss made a bad decision, it was my fault. I either failed to provide him the right information to make the right decision, or I failed to provide him the right information in the right way. Sometimes, however, that's not enough. The political elite of a state responds to the emotions of the people and to other concerns that do not take the full costs of the war into account. Unfortunately, too often, the military, the leg of Clausewitz's triad that represents probability and chance, fails to present their political leaders with the true costs of war in a way that enables the leg that Clausewitz assigns to reason to make rational decisions. In the end, all the military can do and must do is provide the political leaders with their best military advice. After that, it's our duty to execute that policy to the best of our ability, consistent with law, military custom, and the values of our profession. It's up to you as citizens to make sure that emotion does not replace reason.